Welcome to our workshop on the Adolescence Project. We will start with the assumption that a restorative justice path rather than a punitive one is the most appropriate one when we're dealing with adolescents. The Adolescence Project seeks to examine, understand, and address the disproportionate negative impact of the law on society's most vulnerable young people by its failure to recognize and define adolescence between the ages of 12 and 25 as a separate category of human development. That is, separate and apart from each of childhood and adulthood, and also by the law's failure to address adolescent conflict through a developmental lens rather than a criminal lens, in line with the most up-to-date findings of science and medicine. And then, of course, the greatest negative impact of this massive unaddressed gap in justice policy and practice falls upon society's most vulnerable, Indigenous, racialized, and otherwise challenged young people who also lack the supports and resources to manage a legal system that does not recognize them as adolescents, despite the findings of medicine and science. So our first speaker is Ashby Pate. He is the youngest lawyer anywhere in the world to ever be appointed to a Supreme Court bench. Ashby will share in his inimitable way his personal and professional perspective. Then you will hear from Dr. Ashley Vandermorris, a brilliant clinician and researcher from Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. Ashley will talk about adolescence from a scientific perspective and the need for a developmental approach to adolescence.
Well, you wake up in the morning, hear the work bell ring. Well, you're marching to the table, you see the same old thing. Ain't no food upon the table, ain't no pork up in the pan. But you better not complain, boy, you get in trouble with a man. Let the midnight special shine a light on me. Let the midnight special shine ever loving light on me. In January of 1918, there was this young, promising blues musician named Huddie Ledbetter. And one night, after playing a sold-out show in a seedy bar somewhere in Texas, Huddie Ledbetter made a terrible mistake. He got into a fight with a man from his audience over a woman, and in the heat of the moment and in a drunken rage, he stabbed that man to death. And for his crime, he was sentenced to 35 years in Sugar Land Prison, Texas, one of the most notoriously dismal prisons in our country's history. And a few months later, Huddie found himself all alone in his prison cell in the dark in the middle of the night, utterly disconnected from the world that he knew and loved. And he stood up from his bunk and he peered out of the small prison window of his cell. And when he did, he caught sight of a train. It was the Southern Pacific Golden Gate Limited, to be precise, and it always left the Houston station right around midnight. And then this amazing thing happened. As the light from the train started to illuminate the prison walls, Huddie heard his fellow prisoners start singing in this swelling, sort of rapturous lament. Let the midnight special shine a light on me. His fellow prisoners superstitiously believed that if the light from this train shone on their prison cells, they would take it as a sign or a symbol of hope that they might soon be released, that they might soon be reconnected to the world that they had been disconnected from for so long. So Huddie was so moved by his fellow prisoner's song. He's a good musician, so the next morning he puts pen to paper and he turns this swelling traditional folk chorus into the song you just heard me sing a few seconds ago. And here's the best part of the story. after serving the minimum 7 years of his 35-year prison sentence, Huddy sent a crude recording of that song to the hardliner Texas Governor Pat Neff, who had actually run for office on a campaign promise not to issue pardons, but Huddy asked for one. And amazingly, he broke his promise, broke his pledge, and he set this young man free. And upon his release, this promising young musician soon dropped the name Huddy, and he assumed the blues name Lead Belly, becoming the man who is widely considered to be one of the most important and best American blues artists of all time. When Bart Dalton emailed me about 6 months ago and asked me to come give this talk, he asked me to talk about my story. And I have a rather standard 1,000-word response that tracks my legal career and the fortuitous but unlikely events that led up to my appointment. But I'm not going to tell you that side of the story today. I'm going to tell you the other side, which is something I've never told anyone in a setting like this. So apologies in advance if I get a little emotional. The story of how a 34-year-old kid turns into a Supreme Court justice starts, as best I can tell, on a cold winter's night in Birmingham, Alabama, about 15 years ago, long before I decided to go to law school. And like Huddy Ledbetter, I was a promising young musician. And I was playing a show at some seedy bar, and just like Huddy, I too made a terrible mistake. It was a time in my life when my youthful experimentation with drugs was right at the cusp of becoming a serious problem. And I was sitting outside that club in a parked car with some friends, celebrating what a cool rock star I thought I was. And I was doing the type of drugs that I thought cool rock stars did. And suddenly I was pulled out of that car by a plainclothes undercover agent. He slammed me against the hood of my car. He found the drugs he was looking for and put me in the back of his cruiser and took me to the Birmingham City Jail, strip searched me, and threw me into a dark cell in the middle of the night. And a few days later, I stood before a judge, and his name was Judge Pete Johnson. I will never forget him. And I stood before that judge and a young prosecutor and a defense attorney, and I was so ashamed. I thought everything that I'd worked for, I'd squandered. Everything that my parents had given me, I'd flushed down the drain. Because I knew then that that judge and the law itself had the power right then and there to disconnect me from my family, my goals, and society. Because you see, in Alabama, like many states, if you are convicted even of a nonviolent drug possession felony, you are instantly and permanently disconnected and disenfranchised. Instead, Judge Johnson looked down at me, as he did for many others, and he said, "You need help, and I'm going to give you some." He ordered me to report to a program every day for a year, ordered me to drug testing, told me that I would have to do community service until my knuckles bled, but that if I did all those things, he would reconnect me back to the person I thought I was destined to be. He would defer that prosecution and expunge it all, and he would allow me to have a second chance to become a person of value and consequence in the world. And I remember I stood there right at that moment in awe of the law's power to reconnect me back to the person I thought I was destined to be. And I said, thank you, Your Honor. And he looked at me and he said, "To whom much is given, son, much is required." And I don't tell you this story to appear somehow virtuous, to impress you with how far I've come since that night. I tell you because there is power when we commit to apply the law and our lives and the stories we tell to create meaningful human connection in this world. When we realize that the law's highest calling is not to disconnect, but to reconcile. Not to lock people up, but to set them free. And because I'm standing on this stage living proof that you never know who's live or whose lives will be changed.
So I'm a clinician and a researcher, and really my work centers around adolescents and the incredible potential and opportunity that they encompass in terms of being at a stage in their developmental trajectory where really their behaviors and the supports we put in place to support their behaviors can have implications, for their current health and wellness, for their future health and wellness, and if we think, longer term for the next generation of children. Clinically, I work with adolescents who have, often been pushed to the margins for a number of reasons. So young people who are parenting, young people who have a gender identity that's not cisgender, young people with chronic illness, young people with substance issues, and supporting them in reaching their goals and objectives through sort of ongoing relationship and navigation of both health systems and broader structures. And if we think sort of from a socioecological model that starts with the individual, but then sort of permeates out to their families, their communities, this, societies they live in, and then at the, biggest structural level, sort of the laws and policies that govern the societies in which they live and the implications for those youth. So really it starts with that individual and often within the medical system, but the number of influences is multifold and really extends out. So that's my work clinically, and that sort of fits with my work from an academic or research perspective, which is focused again on youth who may encounter structural barriers to optimal health and wellness, both within Canada and globally. So my research is split about 50-50 between youth within Canada and youth in the more global context, and looking at really how do health systems currently engage youth, where are there opportunities to better engage youth, and that really, from my perspective, includes thinking cross-sectorally beyond the traditional bounds of the healthcare system. Because again, we know, for all individuals, but particularly for youth, that most of the factors that influence their health and wellness actually sit outside of the four walls of a hospital or a physician's office and sit in spheres that are not traditionally necessarily engaged by the healthcare system, but really through a sort of integrated collaborative approach can really center an adolescent and think holistically about their journey towards healthy adulthood. Recent advances in neuroscience have actually shed a great deal of light on the process or the neurobiological developmental process that underpins adolescence. We historically thought about adolescence really based on numbers often. So we sort of picked an age at which adolescence started, and that's up for debate what that was. It wasn't always consistent. And then we picked an age where adolescence ended. It tended to be 19. And that was really informed by those sort of socio-demographic bands that we often use in society to mark different age ranges. But there's been a more recent shift to thinking about adolescence from a developmental stance, and thinking about adolescence as typically starting around the time of puberty, which tends to align with some sort of, again, developmental changes, and then really thinking of adolescence as ending with some social role transitions. And over the course of that adolescent trajectory, what neuroscience has shown us is that there are, really quite tremendous brain developmental processes that adolescents are undergoing. And so, whereas we historically thought of the most predominant time of brain development being in infancy, we now recognize, while that is true, that there's this second surge of what we call synaptogenesis, which is the formation of connections within the brain that happens just before puberty starts. And then, throughout adolescence, the brain is sort of honing those connections and really reinforcing the connections that are used a lot and pruning away the connections that aren't used as frequently. So, adolescence is this second remarkable time of brain remodeling. And that brings with it some vulnerabilities, but it also brings with it significant opportunities. And I say that because what we know is that brain remodeling tends to happen first in the more emotional centers of the brain. And that's what's called the limbic system. So that's, I think of it sort of as that flight or fight response, or that really emotional gut, what we think is a gut reaction, which is really brain reaction, but this sort of salience to emotional cues. And then that same type of brain remodeling and refining happens later on in adolescence in the prefrontal cortex, which is like the CEO of the brain. So that's the part of the brain that allows us to plan, anticipate, consider pros and cons. It gives us that reasoned approach. And so if you think about adolescence as starting with this predominance of an emotional reaction that then doesn't really have the sort of mitigating input of the nicely developed prefrontal cortex, you see what we actually see play out in real time, which is adolescents, particularly younger adolescents, tend to be more responsive to emotional cues and often make choices that, even if given information, seem ill-informed to adults who have gone through that entire developmental process. And it's not until adolescents, are older and have a more highly developed prefrontal cortex that they're able to use that information. So, just giving early adolescents information isn't necessarily particularly valuable because they don't actually have a brain that is developed to optimally use that information and apply it to their situation. And those types of insights come from neuroscience, and they're really fantastic. Yeah, I think, in adolescent medicine, certainly, which is my area of specialization, we think developmentally, because that sort of crosses all of those parameters of physiologic, sort of interpersonal, psychological, and we think of adolescence as encompassing really 4 key tasks. And within each of those tasks, there's sort of physical components, there's sort of social components or psychological components. So the key developmental tasks of adolescence are achieving independence from parents, adopting peer codes and lifestyle. So that's really understanding how someone wants to interact with those around them, assigning increased importance to body image and accepting one's body image. And that pertains to some of the physiologic changes that we're talking about in terms of things like pubertal changes. And then establishing an identity. And that encompasses a sexual identity, vocational identity, moral identity. It's really that transition from being an actor in the world who may not be entirely cognizant of what type of person one is to really having the capacity to reflect on who one wants to be and to take action to be that type of person. And that is a late adolescence task. It has a sort of accomplished in late adolescence, meaning, into someone's late teens, early 20s. There is no clear, consistent consensus on the definition of the age of adolescence. The World Health Organization defines adolescence as those aged 10 to 19. So that has traditionally been the way that, for example, health systems define adolescence, as those 10 to 19. Then there's questions around who are youth. And the UN has historically defined youth as 15 to 24. There's there's definitions of youth that span 10 to 29. Recently, sort of in the global health discourse, there's been a push to extend the definition of adolescence at the World Health Organization to include those up to age 24. What this sort of ongoing debate demonstrates is that as the developmental picture is understood more broadly, there's a growing recognition that this chronologic definition of adolescence doesn't really align with what we know is the reality from a neurobiological perspective. And so there's a need to really, again, think more developmentally rather than chronologically. So rather than having these very rigid demographic age bands that don't account for this emerging scientific understanding of adolescent brain development, we really do need to think more developmentally. And that again would allow us to really consider adolescence as starting with the onset of puberty, and then extending up until those social role transitions that typically define adulthood. And that historically may have been marriage and childbirth. Now it's often living independently, having one's first job, and sort of developing a career. And that tends to align with when individuals have sort of traversed the entire landscape of adolescent development and are at that stage where they've developed that strong sense of identity. They have that fully developed, prefrontal cortex that allows them to plan, anticipate, having sort of intentionality to their actions in a way that is a bit different than what we see in early adolescence. So, I think we are seeing, certainly in the medical and scientific world, a real push to approach adolescence from a developmental lens rather than from a chronologic lens. I have this great slide that that was developed by Susan Sawyer and George Patton, who are two real sort of leaders in adolescent health globally. They speak about the fact that adolescence as a life stage actually didn't exist before the Industrial Revolution. So if you think about adolescence as being that time between onset of puberty and those sort of social role transitions to adulthood, historically, that age gap or that time gap was about 2 years. So the time between sort of, for example, a girl having her first period and sort of entering into that, pubertal time frame and becoming a parent was about 2 years. And even as puberty, the onset of puberty got a bit later and later as, conditions improved, the age between onset of puberty and parenthood stayed around, there was about a gap of 2 years. And it was only really with the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of formal education and other opportunities that we saw this widening gap between the onset of puberty and those social role transitions. And that's really when we saw the emergence of this time of an individual's life that we call adolescence now. So it is a more modern phenomenon. It happened over several hundred years in higher income countries. In low income countries, we're seeing that same emergence of adolescence over the course, as you said, of a generation. Really, where the influx of improved, health and wellness for younger children, along with improved opportunities for education, et cetera, have resulted in this burgeoning, cohort of individuals at this life stage called adolescence that really didn't exist in the same way previously. And then societies are sort of having to catch up because that has some, obviously remarkable benefits for the individuals in terms of things like access to education, employment, improved health status, but it also has huge implications for social structures, right? How do we define, how are families structured? How are intergenerational relationships influenced? How is the workforce influenced? So it's a really remarkable shift for all of society as we see this emergence of this life stage. And it hasn't always been there. The concept of, adolescence it's newer to conversations. And I think that's why we're only now having lots of these conversations. But really understanding the science and the developmental sort of underpinnings to that emerging life stage is really something that's much newer. Mid-20th century saw the development of birth control, right? And that was the most recent, again, significant societal and medical innovation that changed the definition of adolescence again, right? Because now, if individuals have reproductive control, again, then some of those social role transitions can be more aligned with the individual's goals and dreams and plans rather than being to some extent left to chance. And so the transition of parenthood has, as we know, the trend has been an upward, a trend in upward age for first childbearing years. And so that aligns with this sort of emerging dialogue around, who are adolescents, how do we account for youth, who fits within that age range. Certainly in Ontario and in most provinces in Canada, there is no age of consent to medical decision making. That really, it's a question of capacity. And so, for an individual to have the capacity to consent to a medical decision or a medical intervention, they have to be able to really understand and appreciate the decision that's in front of them. And that's intentionally not tied to a specific age. There is no hard and fast age at which people are necessarily able to, consistently make the right decision, whatever that may be. But we have to approach each adolescent and the circumstances of, that we're appraising in a much more tailored way, right? To really understand, okay, where is this individual at developmentally, and how do I interpret their behaviors or decision about this specific instance in the context of that developmental stage. So in medicine, that comes up regarding, decisions around treatment. Okay, so here's the specific treatment question in front of us. Here's the individual adolescent. Can they really understand and appreciate the implications of making this decision? And even if I determine that, yes, in fact, they do have the capacity to make this decision A, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the capacity to make decision B, right? That it has to be tailored to the circumstance that we're appraising. And so I think that allows for that agility and that, that incorporation of our understanding of development, our understanding of the adolescent brain, and it allows for that emerging autonomy, while also recognizing the implications of those neurodevelopmental trends. I think the second part is to recognize that, and to sort of to address the concern around sort of not infantilizing or to not reducing developmental insights to an indictment of the ability of an adolescent to make good decisions or decisions at all. I think, what we know is that there's actually research that shows that adolescents are incredibly receptive to socially embedded messaging and interventions. So we can see that in a negative way and say that means that adolescents are susceptible to peer pressure, but that can really be leveraged in a positive way. And what we can see from that is, and there are studies that back this up, that adolescents are incredibly receptive to pro-social influence. So when we think about the opportunity to intervene in a positive way, and I think about, a judge who is going to give, sees a young person in front of them who made a poor choice and thinks they're going to give them another chance, that's sort of substantiated by scientific fact that we know that adolescents' brains are being constantly remodeled, and that if we consistently provide those adolescents with opportunities for positive social interactions that lead to positive or pro-social decisions, that we can alter the trajectory of that adolescent's brain development and that adolescent's future decisions. So there was a study done, I believe in, I think around 2012, 2013, they, put out a bunch of tokens and asked adolescents to choose how many they were going to donate. And so they measured the number of tokens that an adolescent chose to donate if they were just doing it on their own. And then they put them in a circumstance where they saw other people donating tokens. And if they saw other people giving more tokens than what they, the baseline average number of tokens were, adolescents were likely to start donating more tokens. And then if they got messages from peers, other people their age, that encouraged them to donate more tokens, that sort of effect was cumulative. So then they donated even more tokens. It fits with what we know about adolescent brain development, that adolescents have more highly developed emotional centers, the limbic system, which is at the bottom of the brain. If we can appeal to that emotional, social center and reinforce positive decisions and positive actions, that can then be sort of self-sustaining in a way that can support an adolescent in having a healthier and, again, more positive trajectory. So, those decisions that seem sort of like I'm going to take a chance on you are actually relatively well-informed scientific decisions. If we think about neurodevelopment, adolescents are more likely to make decisions despite knowing risks, because risks are often articulated very intellectually, and decisions are often driven very emotionally. So am I going to get in the car with my friend who is drunk and is driving? I know in theory that drunk driving is bad, but in real time, all my friends are getting in the car. There's fun music in the car. It feels good to drive fast, right? So we know that the adolescent brain is truly wired to be more receptive to and to prioritize those social and emotional inputs. And so we do need to understand that adolescents really will make decisions that may not seem to adults to be aligned with a really thorough, risk-benefit appraisal would indicate. And so we need to account for that and understand that that's not because the adolescent is necessarily intentionally making the wrong decision. It's because their brain is wired to interpret that balance differently than an adult brain would interpret that. And then, am I surprised that there's no formal definition of adolescence in the legal system? I mean, no, I'm not surprised. There's, a definition of childhood and there's a definition of adulthood that have been relatively static for a long time. And adolescents are sort of thought of, depending on who's looking, either as big children or little adults. Historically, when often sort of many of these notions or approaches were being codified, I don't think we recognized that adolescence was anything more than this time between these very poignant experiences of childhood and the harsh reality of adulthood when kids, teens were just being teens. And I don't think we really understood or appreciated the again, neurodevelopmental underpinnings. And so we didn't feel the need to account for that. As much as within medicine, we have the privilege and the resources and the opportunity to make that sort of more detailed appraisal. It's very uncomfortable still, right? I think there is still this historic burden, I guess, of thinking of adolescents as being under the care of their parents, and the tension between, often what parents may want and what an adolescent may want. can sometimes come into conflict in a way that can be difficult to navigate. These aren't easy, these aren't easy questions, and they aren't easy assessments. And so I think often when things feel uncomfortable or things are difficult, there's this tendency to want to rely on the concrete or sort of objective definition and categorization, and what is really requires, a very subjective and nuanced assessment. And I think that there's a sort of a tendency to sort of fall back to these ways, these more sort of comfortable positions that sometimes absolve us of feeling like we have the responsibility for that decision, right? Well, it's like, well, they're under 18, so, if their parents are really not in support of it, there's not much we can do. Well, that actually doesn't really fit with what we know about adolescence and what we know about what's best in supporting healthy adolescent development, which is to try and positively support those decision-making skills and that emerging autonomy, and offer adolescents opportunities to make decisions in a way that are safe and supported, and allow them to have some role in that. And depending again on the decision at hand, it may not be the full scope of the decision, but finding those opportunities to recognize where there is emerging autonomy, but also to recognize that that needs to be supported, right? There needs to be that scaffolding. My guiding principle, and I think the principle that really centers the adolescent, is one of taking a strengths-based, developmentally tailored approach. So we recognize that, each individual adolescent, comes to, for example, my office after a journey that's been punctuated and, determined by any number of influences and factors that have shifted and shaped the way that, their life course has unfolded to the point at which they reach me. And then when they reach me, there's an incredible opportunity to, reinforce the factors that have been positive in that young person's life, and to sort of try and shift away from some of the influences that have negative implications, or reinforce patterns that may be protective for that young person, but not necessarily beneficial for that young person. But that has to be done in collaboration and partnership with the adolescent. It can't be done by me. Restorative justice is very well aligned with best practices in adolescent health and wellness and medicine, because it really centers the adolescent and their unique set of circumstances, and works to build on their strengths and to reinforce their opportunities to move forward from where they're at along a healthier and more positive trajectory.
Thank you, Judge Pate, for a memorable presentation, and Dr. Vander Morris for your amazing and important insights. Our next two speakers are Stephanie Di Giuseppe, a Toronto criminal and constitutional lawyer with deep knowledge and experience with adolescents and the law. After Stephanie, you will hear from Marsha Rampersad, a PhD candidate who's doing amazing sociological research with adolescents 18 to 25 years of age. These are young people who have come through the child welfare system and have been seriously impacted in a negative way by the justice system.
I'm a criminal defense and constitutional lawyer. My practice ranges the full gamut from pretty minor possession of marijuana charges to serious criminal prosecutions for violent offenses and homicides. I practice also in the regulatory context, so legal practitioners or medical practitioners who are facing proceedings in front of disciplinary tribunals. So I understand both sides of the coin of what we're talking about today. My practice is quite diverse in terms of the people I interact with, but I certainly, over the course of my career, have represented a large number of male racialized youth between the ages of 18 and 25. For quite a while, the bulk of my practice was fit within that demographic, and I represented them on all sorts of different kinds of charges. All we're really doing right now to target the fact that people between the ages of 18 to 25 have a different brain and a different level of maturity than people older than the age of 25 or even older than the age of 30, according to some researchers, is we're giving that a bit of consideration on sentencing. but we are not doing anything to clearly define this demographic, to put special procedures or special formal mechanisms into the law that reflects the lack of maturity that is just demonstrated by science and very relevant to behavior. But the law is not doing very much in a formal way to recognize that distinction. And I think that's really problematic. I think the arbitrary line between 17 and 18 is really just a reflection of Parliament feeling that they need to draw a line and just choosing a line, maybe for historical reasons more than anything that has to do with what we now recognize in cognitive behavioral science. And one of the things that is particularly troublesome about the line is it paints everybody with the same brush. So if you grew up marginalized, if you grew up with childhood poverty, if you grew up experiencing significant childhood trauma, we know that that is going to impact your important skills that help you stay out of the criminal justice system, like behavioral control. But the 18-year cutoff applies to everyone. It doesn't look at your life experience. It doesn't look at your education level. It doesn't look at the advantages or disadvantages you may have had, even from something as simple as just having good parenting and good role models. So when we create an arbitrary line, no matter what, I think that we are going to end up treating people who deserve the benefits of the youth criminal justice system with the very harsh instrument of the adult criminal justice system. And that's a significant problem. All the time, I encounter clients who can't really understand the criminal justice system, the real world procedures and implications of it, even though they're 18 years old. 18 is quite young. If you think about it, over the course of your own life, you've just graduated from high school. You've not gone through the experience of college or university. And I bet if most of us think back to that time, we think, wow, I was a completely different person with a different risk tolerance, with a different ability to control my impulses, much more led by peer pressure, much more ingrained in my social group and what they thought of me. It's a completely different state of mind. So my clients who are over 18 are no different. They can't understand the idea that a criminal record will follow them for their entire life because they don't have the maturity level to have the foresight of what their entire life entails yet. They are thinking about the next couple of years. They're thinking about what's happening on Friday night. They're thinking like teenagers. They're not thinking like mature adults. This is something that everybody can understand because everybody can think back to something that they did when they were in their early 20s that they would never do today. Maybe it's the way you behaved in a relationship. Maybe it is the ways that you experimented with drugs or alcohol. Maybe it's your inability to control your temper, right? We learn and we mature and we grow. But one of the things that really has a huge impact on 18 to 25-year-olds in the criminal justice system is also their ability to make decisions and to think in a long-term way. So as a practitioner, as a lawyer, I engage with my clients and around the idea of making life-altering decisions, like the decision of whether or not to plead guilty, or the decision of whether or not to enter into some sort of diversion program, to accept a plea bargain, to testify at their trial. And these decisions are, I don't want to say impossible, but they're very difficult to wrap your head around and understand the implications of at that age. And the consequences of those decisions for 18 to 25-year-olds are lifelong. So it creates, I think it's problematic for the entire system. I think it's problematic for us that we are accepting guilty pleas from 18-year-old kids who don't understand what the long-term consequences of that plea is. Because the criminal justice system consequences, never mind just your immediate sentence, but the social stigma, employment consequences, The idea that you may never be able to qualify for a mortgage, you may never be able to rent an apartment, you may never be able to be bonded. To try explaining to an 18-year-old, well, one day you might want to do a job where you have to be bonded. It's going right over their head. So that sort of undermines the system as a whole, because we're allowing people to enter into decisions that they aren't really competent to make. For a very long time, we have been answering the problem of criminality with essentially a one-stop solution. We have made some advances, I think, in terms of diversion. We have taken these very small incremental steps towards doing a bit better. But essentially, the only thing we have in our toolkit is jail. And jail is under-resourced, horrible place where nothing is being done to actually address problems, and it's punitive. So, if you think about how far we've come, even in the realm of parenting, we have basically learned as a society that punitive solutions to child-like behavioral problems only make children worse. We don't hit kids by and large anymore. We have learned that we should be reacting with patience and love when children are acting out. But we have not been able to manifest that as a society when it comes to dealing with our society's children in the formal institutions in which we deal with them when they're having behavioral problems. And that's primarily schools and the criminal justice system. And so I think, it might sound a bit trite, but I think that a system that works and that delivers proper social systems is sort of built on love and an understanding of childhood, and understanding that we have to actually bond with children who are experiencing behavioral problems. We have to actually show them that they are worthy, that they can be better, that they can be part of a society that cares for them, that wants them, that is welcoming to them. And if that's our overall mentality, we will fill in the details. I know that the details are things like subsidized counseling. I know the details are things like a better child welfare system. Those are huge details, but they're the details. I think that the big picture is to start treating children, adolescents, and youth as a society the way that we treat our own children, adolescents, and youth inside our homes, and the way that we either wish we were treated when we were at that stage in life. I believe that a very great percentage of what we do in the criminal justice system could be taken outside of the criminal justice system. And I particularly think that applies to a great deal of the behavioral issues and conflict that we see within this age group we've been talking about. So youth from 18 to 25. But a lot of it is situational. It has to do with not having developed or honed the necessary life skills that a person needs to interact in adult society. And a lot of it has to do, again, with the influence of peers, groupthink, and group mentalities. And then we've got our three major causes of crime across the board, which are mental health, poverty, and the experiences of early life trauma, which have been shown to be major criminogenic factors. What of everything I've just said screams to you the solution is to lock people in cages? You see, nothing I've said right now, if you were to actually take it and look at it from sort of the perspective of a system architecture, like a systems architect, I'm identifying the problem and now I'm going to put together a good method to solve it. Would you say, well, a really great method to solve this is let's take all the kids who are experiencing these problems, lock them in bare bones cells, with minimal supervision, absolutely no diversion, no access to education, no access to programming, no access to counseling, no access to adults who they trust or love. And let's just let them figure it out for themselves. And that's going to make them better people. I mean, that's clearly not the solution. So what we really need to be doing is to actually understand our problem and design a solution that is evidence-based and thoughtful. That solution, I think, is we're using the term restorative justice more and more as sort of a catch-all term for developing those kinds of solutions. And what it really means is providing infrastructure support, education, counseling in a targeted way, depending on what the individual experiencing the problem needs and what the real individualized problem actually is. I believe that we can do it. I think we can learn a lot, just as Peacebuilders has, from even Canada's Indigenous people who seem to have developed on their own a much more restorative model of justice that's quite beautiful and that we can learn so much from. But it means working on ourselves as individuals and ourselves as a society to want to embrace a model that is much healthier for everyone. Something I think that's really interesting about the model for a tribunal outside of the criminal justice system to address youth behavioral issues is that that model could be so much less adversarial. So right now, because the mere fact of a criminal conviction carries so much social stigma and lifelong consequence, in the criminal justice system, we are so focused on determining guilt. And we are so adversarial in the methods that we go about that. By and large, there's, we do some good things with diversion and whatnot, but by and large, this is the model. I've always thought it's so interesting. I could spend 3 weeks on a trial to try to figure out whether somebody committed a robbery, and then we could sentence that person in half a day. The focus is not on what comes next. Judges have very little in their toolbox. We talk about, what duration should this person stay in jail. We know a little bit about them, and judges are learning more and more about these people. And then they have just this, gapingly empty toolbox to address those problems. And this is I think, the most significant failing of the criminal justice system at this point in time. So what interests me about the idea of a tribunal is that it could be more intervention-based, that because a tribunal finding would not carry the stigma of criminal conviction, we could focus much less on the question of guilt or innocence and much more on the question of, tell us about the factors that brought you here, and let's design a plan for you that keeps you out of the criminal justice system. We don't even care so much what happened. What we care is that it's evidence that something's going wrong around you, and the focus is now to devise a plan that means you never come back here. Something that I've always found interesting about my job is I will interact with so many people that society would brand as criminal or bad seeds or bad. And with very little exception, they all want to be good people. They just don't know how. For whatever reason, whether it's a lot of it comes down to those big three: poverty, mental health, and trauma, not just of themselves, but also issues with their parents as well in those big three. And they are so malleable, and they're so in a position in terms of their brain development where they can be influenced so strongly. And I think something that's, funny, but it's really not funny, is that we've decided that the good thing to do with those people is to put them in a custodial institution. What we're doing is we're taking these malleable young people, and again, we're lumping them together with a whole bunch of other young people who are on the wrong path, and a whole bunch of seasoned criminals in a jail setting where they have almost no good influence. And I'm laughing, but it's not funny because it is a fundamental mistake. It defies common sense and it defies logic. It's the kind of system that could only be created by somebody who paid zero attention to the science around young people's brain development, and or somebody that frankly doesn't care about bringing these young people back into society and ensuring that they develop into good, pro-social, productive adults. There are some legal doctrines which ask the court to operate in loco parentis, which is like a Latin term that means as if you're in the shoes of the person's parents. The idea of asking judges to step into those shoes and to look at a young person who has made a mistake from a position of love, a parental position, I think is a beautiful idea. I think it's a hallmark of a much healthier society that is dealing with young people the way that they really need and deserve to be dealt with based on where they are in their development in life. It's exciting to think about a system where judges are treating young people from that parental role. But one thing that really gets exciting on a fundamental level about this project that Peacebuilders is talking about is the idea of designing a whole system around that mentality or from that starting place. So not only are we looking at individuals from a place of love, from a place of stewardship and parenting, but we are designing a whole system based around that idea. So that when young people come into the system, it is not just a system designed for adults that has been put in place because we weren't creative enough to come up with something that was specifically geared towards youth. We just copied what we had in place for adults, or we just never really thought much about it. Instead, we've designed a special system that really thinks along the lines of, in our group role as a society of shepherding young people on the path from childhood to adulthood, what do we do with that in-between time from 18 to 25 or 18 to 30 that understands who those young people are and allows them to make that transition smoothly, a transition through a time that is a complicated time for the developing brain. So the idea of being in loco parentis is not just something that we can apply to each individual case, but a way we can think about designing the system as a whole. We are in a very perhaps painful right now growing process, but that we are going to come out of it a much better society when dealing with these types of problems. We are evolving out of a sort of caveman retribution mentality in criminal justice right now, and we're moving towards something better. And it's very exciting to be here at this point, watching that happen and seeing things get better right before our eyes.
So I'm a PhD student in sociology at Queen's. My research really focuses on this one particular population. So they're 18 to 24-year-olds, young adults who have had dual involvement in two systems. They've had involvement in both the child welfare system and the criminal justice system. It provides really interesting insights into their experiences with the justice system if they come into conflicts with the law after they've turned 18. I really took the lead from doing my research with practitioners. I've been interviewing workers, social workers, and other community workers I've sort of been in conversation with who work with this young adult population, and all of their programming is called youth programming, even though they're working with populations that are over the age of 18. So interviewing these social workers who are assigned to work with folks who are 18, sometimes all the way up to 29, and making that deliberate language choice to call these young people youth, it got me thinking about this sort of conflict that exists between legal adulthood, how the law views an adult, versus how people who are on the ground, who are working with this population daily, are defining youth. Criminologists have been documenting this for quite some time. We kind of have this age crime curve, which is well documented in the criminology literature, where we see a peak in offending from 15 to maybe 17. But again, there's not a sharp drop off that occurs at 18. Instead, it kind of slowly trickles down, and a lot of young people start to desist from crime is what they call it. So they stop engaging in that kind of behavior closer to their mid-20s. So we've got this sort of tension in the legal system where it's legal adulthood begins at 18, but that isn't in line with broader offending patterns. Folks are staying at home longer. They're relying on the support of their parents or their families for longer. So a lot of these big markers of adulthood, living independently, home ownership, marriage, starting a family, these are all occurring way later. So there's just from all sides, there's tons of evidence to show that this young adult period, this transition to adulthood, this youth period, adolescence period, it's longer than the law, than legal adulthood actually recognizes. I would say that it encompasses a lot, like from 18 to 29 almost. This adolescence period, it's a period of transition to adulthood. So it's distinct from being a young person, from being a child or a youth, because you do have a little bit more maturity. You have some responsibility. You can vote, you can drive, you can buy alcohol, those kinds of things. So there is a recognition of increased maturity between, say, an 18 or 19-year-old and a 13, 14, 15-year-old. But there's a huge difference that we don't recognize between an 18, 19, 20-year-old and a 30-year-old or a 35-year-old. One stat that exists is that roughly 40 to 45% of young people who are exiting from the care system will come into conflict with the law. There's so much about that particular time in their lives where they're really trying to figure everything out. A lot of the circumstances that they find themselves in make criminal involvement difficult to avoid during that period. So it's unsurprising that a number like 40 to 45% of young people coming out of care going into the justice system would be happening, but it's alarming. About 30% of folks are offending during that high peak time of 15 to 17. So that is a significant number in the lifespan of crime. 30% of offending behavior happens from 15 to 17, but then another 30% happens between 18 and 25. So I want to give you a bit of a sense of some of the circumstances that a young person faces just by nature of them turning 18 years old. This is a statistic that's well known, is that 43% of young people who exit care will experience homelessness during that 18 to 24-year-old window. They're no longer living in their foster or group home placements. And so for many of them, that equates to a severing, like an abrupt severing of their social supports. I don't know the exact number, but it's over 50% of young people from care do not graduate high school. One of the young folks I interviewed told me that during his final exam period of high school, it was June of his last year of high school, and he was turning 18 in July. And he knew that when he turned 18, he was going to have to leave his foster placement. He was going to have to find housing on his own. He was going to be all alone. And so that was really what occupied his entire focus during that last month of high school. And he failed all of his exams. And when I interviewed him, I believe he's 22 or 23 now, but he still hasn't completed high school. This population disproportionately experiences mental illness. They disproportionately experience a reliance on substances. And they're doing this all during a time where they're really left to their own devices. It's just like the perfect storm. And so that is why there is such a large number of these young people who find themselves in conflict with the law. One of the lawyers that I interviewed put it so perfectly. They said that if folks didn't have mental health issues and if folks didn't have substance use issues, then I would never have a client. And that is so telling of what our legal system has become a catchment for. So if there were a tribunal that was separate from the legal system that didn't carry the same, threat of a criminal record and all of the consequences that come with having a criminal record, if there was a possibility that we could look at young people in a holistic way and really work with them to support them through those challenges they face in young adulthood, I would be fully supportive. Having this specialized court or tribunal that could really build case law and build recognition for what these young people are going through could have huge impacts. I learned so much from the young people that I interviewed about what they're experiencing, some of the challenges they face, and they're wonderful human beings who deserve support, deserve ongoing support.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Marcia. Your insights on the intersection between poverty, lack of opportunity, family, and the legal system are critically important. The next two speakers are the Honorable Brian Scully, a highly experienced Ontario court judge with vast experience presiding over adolescent cases, and also Marlon Merraro, the Executive Director of Peacebuilders Canada. Marlon is also a board member and member of the Executive and Governance Committee of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto. Marlon is a leading advocate of equity, community development, and outreach.
We were successful, of course, with the Young Offenders Act in having that enacted in 1984. The difficulty at that time was that council, and I have to say the judiciary, really weren't educated in terms of this being considered a separate system of justice. And as a result, we had the unenviable record of incarcerating proportionally more young persons under the Young Offenders Act than certainly our common law jurisdiction countries, the European countries, and even proportionally higher than the United States. It was reflective, in fact, of governments not really accepting that 17 and 18-year-olds, or 16 and 17-year-olds, were young persons as opposed to adults. This, despite the science that was developing, recognizing frontal lobe development, impulse control didn't really mature until age 25. Fortunately, in 2003, enacted the Youth Criminal Justice Act, and as a result, the level of custody fell really dramatically. Sadly, it didn't really have the same effect for detention, particularly as it related to our Indigenous youth and our racialized youth, and very specifically to our Black youth. They continue to be detained at an alarming rate prior to a finding of guilt. We certainly are aware, those of us who work in the system, that the distinction of 17, 18, 19, 20, when I was a lawyer, I did both criminal law, adult criminal law, youth law. It became very clear to me that I was sometimes dealing with a 20-year-old, for instance, who had the emotional, mental quotient of recognizing criminal responsibility of maybe a 15 or 16-year-old. So it was somewhat arbitrary. We were looking at trying to find that age definition. Certainly we're aware that in a number of European jurisdictions, Germany, Sweden, Portugal, Croatia, the age limit for criminal jurisdiction is 18, but in those countries there's a range between 18 and 21 in which a judge in sentencing a young person, if they found them guilty, can take into consideration their mental maturity, perhaps their emotional maturity, social maturity, and choose at their discretion to sentence them under the youth legislation as opposed to as adults. And I think that that's really reflective of what we now know about the development and social development of young persons, and would be a path that I think in Canada we should follow. Perhaps as much as 30% of our persons in the penitentiary system were at one point involved in the child welfare system as children and as youth. And that trauma marked them for life. And sadly, there wasn't an early enough recognition of the trauma they were experiencing. There wasn't programming made available to them to address those issues of trauma. And as a result, they developed a manner of relating to people that, when challenged with authority, would tend to be very assertive. We would call it aggressive, which, of course, lands them into the criminal justice system. And it was very tragic for me sometimes, representing 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds with that kind of experience, knowing that because of the violence perpetrated, they would be going to the penitentiary service. and understanding that in the penitentiary service, sadly, there's just not the programming, the counseling, the therapy that's available to deal with those issues of long-standing trauma. I think that it would be really wonderful if judges were given more discretion in that young adult group. Consideration has to be given to alternatives to custody, recognizing that sentencing someone to custody as an adult, sentencing them to the penitentiary system, is really a form of education that is likely not going to be very productive for society. My colleagues working in the adult world certainly give a great deal of consideration to that age group, if you like, 18 through 25 already. It would be very helpful for them if they had more discretion in terms of perhaps a sentencing situation, and it would be reflected in recidivism. It would be reflected in success of counseling and therapy, education, vocation. I think those things, if those facilities were available, not just to the age of 18, but if they were available to certainly young adults, and a judge had discretion to provide sentences to them that would allow them access to those programs, that would be really helpful. I would like to see a diversion program that the police could make reference to for young adults that they find engaged in criminal behavior, but they feel would perhaps benefit from a diversion system as opposed to the criminal justice system. I would like that system to be available to Crowns to use at their discretion as well. I think what has been experienced in many of the youth courts in this province, and I think in this country, it would be really of great value if that experience could be expanded. I would hope that part of the education of those persons who work with youth, be it in the legal system, be it in the child welfare system, that they have education in trauma and learn to look at young people from a trauma-informed lens, to have an understanding, hopefully a deep understanding, of the systemic racism that exists in our society, and be able, with that knowledge and understanding, to approach young persons in a manner that will allow them to succeed, to listen to them. And I think with an understanding of trauma, with an understanding of systemic racism, oppression, my perspective is that those persons working with youth in the systems, from whatever perspective, would in fact have a whole new capacity to hear the voice of youth. I've known Eva for a long time, and she has been so dedicated, committed, unswerving in her efforts to find alternatives, forms of justice for young people. And it's inspiring. And the work that Peacebuilders is a great asset to our court.
Hi, my name is Marlon Merraro. I'm the Executive Director for Peacebuilders Canada. At Peacebuilders Canada, we use a restorative justice model to address the issues that impact young people and their families in the school system and in the justice system. We provide alternatives to punitive consequences for those who are making decisions that sometimes are to the detriment of themselves and the families that they reside in. You would see in our programs the disproportionality of young racialized communities, those who are facing poverty, those who do not have the social networks to advance their own personal life goals, those who live in communities that are over-policed, not because they want to be over-policed, but because of who they are and their skin color, their economic status, and because of the neighborhood that they live in. We're trying to bring forward a restorative message that yes, young people who make bad mistakes can restore the harm that they have caused, but that we want to also hold those systems accountable to restore the harm that they have caused in regards to decolonization of our justice system, in regards to the racial bias that happens at all aspects and all levels within the justice system. We have to hold ourselves as institutions accountable, but we also have to hold young people accountable with a supportive arm at the same time. We have young people who are in care of the child welfare system and are also in the justice system. And so if young people make the bad decision in those circumstances of being in child welfare, being homeless, of also facing charges and not having a parent or adult to come to your court date, that sticks with a young person, I think, for life. We need to recognize that making decisions in that context is not a decision that is solely all of the responsibility of that young person. It cannot be. So I think it's imperative for us to recognize that child welfare, homelessness, undereducation, underemployment, there is a line that goes right through all of those systems. And it's young people who have been traumatized, young people who are hurt, young people who are facing mental health issues, and young people that don't have the necessary family supports and privileges that some of us have. And that's an important consideration when we look at justice. We've created that number 18. Adolescence for me really starts at the age of 14 and goes right to about 27. An adult is a journey to adulthood. There's a journey. There's rites of passages to adulthood. And I think what we need to do when we think about justice and saying to young people, after 18, you're going to be tried and you're going to be held accountable like an adult, is actually doing a disservice to ourselves and our communities. We want young people to be able to understand the impact that they have, understand that the power that they wield as young, vibrant, creative individuals, and we want to nurture that. We don't want to penalize them, stick them into an institution with people that are 30, 40, 50, and learn from that group of people of how to be the adults that we don't want them to be. You want 18-year-olds to be a different kind of adult? Put them in a different system, not in the system where you're going to recreate more of what you don't want. So I don't think we should be throwing young people in adult court at all. I think it should be at least 25 to 27, that age range where we are looking to be supportive to those young people so that when they hit their 30s and beyond, they have the capabilities, they have the support networks needed to be some individuals in society, and they have time to reflect on who they are as individuals that journey to adulthood. They are what I would call emerging adults. And throwing them in an adult court, throwing them in adult institutions is the worst thing you can do because they will end up on the streets. They've already been through children's aid. They've already been homeless. They've already lost their parents. They've already faced trauma. And then we want to re-traumatize them. They need people to share with them what life has to offer and all the many things that are out there. I think it's important for the government to define and understand what adolescence is for really good reasons. Data, research, and knowledge is driving our legislative policies. What we know, what we've researched, what we've invested in our scientific community have said, this is what we know, and put that into practice. I think that's one important thing. The second piece is it can actually help to address some of the disproportionality that's in our system. So when you look at the number of young people who are in a child welfare system that also ended up in the justice system, if we look at them differently, then that overrepresentation will be addressed because we will be putting in the supports to support those young adolescents, emerging adults, versus criminalizing them. So the cost to our justice system, I believe, will be far less. When we think about restorative justice, it is going to restore a historical problem that us as a country have had since the beginning of our country. When we think about the disproportionality of Black and Indigenous people in the court system, there are some facts that we know that racial bias and racism, institutional racism, systemic racism play a large role in why they are where they are. But the other driver for why they are disproportionately in the justice system is the fact that many of those communities are communities that have been historically denied economic access, historically been denied access to proper education. We have been denied seeing ourselves in the history books. Looking at disproportionality, we have to look at the individual, the historical context of those individuals, how we value those individuals, and then look at what are we as decision makers and those with privilege, what are we doing to address the issue of disproportionality? What's the appetite for changing the legislation and having a definition and changing the foundational principles? And I think the appetite for change is there. We see it. People are marching. In my neighborhood, I've never seen so many Black Lives Matter posters in my neighborhood. And I don't live in a diverse neighborhood, racially diverse neighborhood. So I think there is an appetite for the general public to see us do things differently. And what seems to be missing in that appetite is for our institutions, for our history, which becomes the future and the present, to rethink their historical ways of doing business, how we construct our society. I think communities at large are learning and growing because diversity is everywhere. We are not going to be less diverse as a nation or as a city. We're going to be more diverse. And through that diversity becomes great strength, great innovation, great learning. I think we also need to look at abolishing the data that travels with those young person into their adulthood. If they made a mistake, why at 30, 35, when they're crossing the US border, are they going to be stopped and denied entry because they made a mistake when they were 18? I think there's something that needs to shift for us as adult caregivers of our youth. And I mean all of our youth. We need to change how we view young people and the system that we as adults have created for them to either thrive and survive and do well, or to become victims and be traumatized and then create more victims. What Eva and others are proposing is that if we have greater options of dealing with what we know, what the science has been telling us, what our history and knowledge has been telling us, and it can be housed within the justice system, those options will create better outcomes. So if you have a young person that instead of getting charged has a wraparound service to look at themselves, their family, education, trauma that they've faced, supports that may be necessary, neighborhood conflict that might be also a part of it. If you're in a space where you're looking at dealing with the various issues that someone brings to you, and not just one incident in a time period, then the challenge for us as providers of that service becomes resourcing and building a relationship and working with those individuals so that they never come into our program again because they won't need the kind of supports that we would offer. This third option gives all the providers opportunities to engage, to build relationships, and to solve some of the root causes of the problems and not just the symptoms of the problem. And I think that model is where we should be headed.
When we're talking about adolescents, young adults, human beings in general are fed by connection and by nurturing and by being in a situation where they can learn from other human beings. And that's the way we learn, that's the way we grow. And at a time when our prefrontal lobes are still developing, is there any greater necessity than to make sure that those human beings, more than anyone, are afforded the opportunity to continue to grow and to continue to connect with other human beings? When you really, really decide to look at what causes these problems and the people who we're called upon to help, you can't help but become more restorative in nature. Because when you see our common humanity, you recognize yourself in the person you're trying to help. I'm not necessarily talking about the mystical oneness of all things deep down, but I kind of am. And we need to be aware of that, and it should bleed over into our professional lives.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Pate, and thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your deep knowledge and experience, which will undoubtedly continue to help shape a better future for young people in Canada. Marlon, your passion and commitment shine through everything you do and say. Thank you so much. So clearly, we have lots of work to do to improve things for adolescents who get caught up in the justice system. As so many of our speakers pointed out today, the challenges are large and complex, and we are just at the beginning of this journey. But there are literally thousands of dedicated social workers, legal professionals, scientists, and many others working hard to improve circumstances for adolescents. We hope you enjoyed this presentation and see it as a renewed call for further discussion and exploration of the issues facing adolescents in our justice system. Now is the time to look past our silos and our trepidation and work together, collaborate, and discover solutions. To that end, I'm asking all of you to reach out to me at info@peacebuilders.ca with ideas, contacts, insights, or other information that you believe will be helpful in our effort to create a more effective, equitable, and engaged justice system for Canadian adolescents. Thank you for your time today, and thank you to the symposium organizers for giving us this chance to present a variety of very important voices.